At my husband's funeral, don't believe their tears. I'm alive. Chapter 1. The Message from the Dead. The mahogany coffin descended into the earth with the mechanical precision of a Swiss watch, and that's when my phone buzzed against my thigh like a serpent awakening. I shouldn't have looked. Any decent widow would have kept her eyes fixed on the hole swallowing her husband of 37 years. But Victoria Whitmore had never been accused of being decent, only rich, ruthless, and right about most things that mattered. The screen lit up with a number I knew by heart. Marcus's number. My dead husband's number. Don't believe their tears. I'm alive. My hand trembled so violently that I nearly dropped the phone into the grave alongside the coffin. Around me, 200 of Washington, D.C.'s elite dabbed their eyes with silk handkerchiefs, their grief as carefully orchestrated as a Broadway production. But I couldn't hear their sniffles or the pastor's droning words about eternal rest. All I could hear was my heartbeat thundering in my ears like a freight train. Marcus was dead. I had identified his body myself. I had watched them zip him into that black bag 3 days ago, his dark skin ashen, his strong hands finally still. The medical examiner had shrugged when I demanded answers. No obvious cause of death. Maybe his heart. Maybe stress. Maybe God just decided it was time for a 62-year-old black man who'd built an empire from nothing to finally rest. But dead men don't send text messages. Mom. My daughter Sarah's voice cut through my paralysis. She stood beside me in her designer black dress, her mixed-race features a perfect blend of her father's strength and my own sharp angles. At 35, she was everything I'd raised her to be. Brilliant, beautiful, and ruthlessly ambitious. Her husband David hovered behind her like a shadow, his pale hands resting protectively on her shoulders. David. My son-in-law of 5 years, the man who'd swept my daughter off her feet with his boyish charm and Harvard MBA, the man who'd wormed his way into Marcus's good graces, becoming the son he'd never had, the man whose blue eyes now watched me with something that might have been concern or calculation. I'm fine, I whispered, shoving the phone back into my purse, but I wasn't fine. I was either losing my mind or discovering that my husband's death was the opening act of a play I hadn't auditioned for. The pastor concluded his remarks, and the crowd began to disperse like well-dressed vultures fleeing a picked-clean carcass. I remained frozen beside the grave, watching dirt fall onto polished wood, when I felt David's presence beside me. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice carrying that slight Boston accent that had once charmed me. Sarah's worried about you. Maybe we should head back to the house. I studied his face, the concerned furrow of his brow, the way his lips pressed together in what looked like grief. But his eyes were different, sharper, like he was watching a chess game and calculating his next move. Yes, I said slowly. I think that would be wise. But as we walked toward the line of black cars waiting to ferry us back to the Whitmore estate, my phone buzzed again. This time, I was ready. The greenhouse, midnight. Come alone, Victoria. Trust no one, especially not David. My dead husband, it seemed, had quite a lot to say. Chapter 2, 37 Years of Secrets. The Whitmore estate sprawled across 15 acres of prime Virginia countryside, far enough from D.C. to feel like a sanctuary, but close enough to remind everyone of our influence. Marcus had bought it in 1987 when he was still clawing his way up from the streets of Southeast D.C., determined to give his family the kind of life his own father had only dreamed of. Now it felt like a mausoleum. The house overflowed with mourners offering condolences that tasted like sawdust in my mouth. I smiled and nodded and played the grieving widow while my mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. Hallucinations brought on by grief? Some cruel joke by a hacker who'd somehow gotten hold of Marcus's phone? Or, and this was the thought that made my blood run cold, was my husband actually alive? Victoria, darling, I'm so sorry for your loss. I turned to find Margaret Ashford, the wife of Senator Ashford, pressing a perfectly manicured hand to my arm. Margaret and I had moved in the same circles for decades, our friendship built on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. She was useful, well-connected, discreet, and hungry enough for social advancement to keep secrets when necessary. Thank you, Margaret. Marcus always spoke so fondly of you and the senator. It was a lie. Marcus had thought Senator Ashford was a spineless puppet, and Margaret a social climber who'd married her way into relevance. But grief, I'd learned, required performance. Such a shock, Margaret continued, lowering her voice to that conspiratorial whisper wealthy women used to discuss other people's tragedies. So young, so healthy. Though I suppose the stress of building an empire. She let the sentence hang, fishing for details I wasn't prepared to share. His heart, I said simply. You know how hard he worked. Margaret nodded sympathetically, but I caught the gleam in her eyes. She was already calculating how Marcus's death might affect her husband's political ambitions, what business opportunities might open up, what social dynamics would shift in our rarefied world. I excused myself and retreated to Marcus's study, the one room in the house that still smelled like him, leather and expensive cologne and the faint trace of the cigars he'd smoked when he thought I wasn't looking. His mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface cleared of everything except a single photograph, our wedding day in 1987. I had been 23 then, fresh out of Spelman College with a business degree and ambitions that terrified my parents. Marcus had been 25, already making a name for himself in real estate development, already dreaming of the empire he'd eventually build. We'd been partners from the start. In love, yes, but also in business, in ambition, in the careful cultivation of power that had made us untouchable. Or so I'd thought. Mom? Sarah stood in the doorway, her face etched with concern. Behind her, David lingered in the hallway, and I wondered if he'd sent her to check on me or if she'd come on her own. Come in, sweetheart. I gestured to the leather chair across from the desk. Close the door. She did, then settled into the chair where Marcus used to sit when we'd discuss business late into the night. The resemblance between father and daughter was striking, the same determined jaw, the same intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Are you all right? She asked. You seemed distant during the service. I weighed my options. Sarah was my daughter, my blood, my heir, but she was also David's wife. And after 5 years of marriage, where did her loyalties truly lie? The text messages felt like a warning, but warnings about what? About whom? Grief is strange, I said carefully. It makes you question everything you thought you knew. What do you mean? Before I could answer, David appeared in the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, but the lawyer's here. Mr. Blackwood says he needs to speak with the family about the will. Of course he did. Marcus wasn't even cold in the ground. And already the vultures were circling. But the reading of the will was necessary, a ritual that would determine not just who inherited what, but who held power in the empire Marcus had built. I stood smoothing my black dress. Let's get this over with. But as we walked toward the living room where Harold Blackwood waited with his briefcase full of legal documents, my phone buzzed once more. Don't let them rush you. The will isn't what you think it is. My dead husband, it seemed, was full of surprises. Chapter 3: The Last Will and Testament. Harold Blackwood had been the Whitmore family attorney for over 20 years, a thin man with silver hair and the kind of discreet manner that made him invaluable to wealthy families with complicated secrets. He'd handled everything from Marcus's business acquisitions to the quiet settlement of a harassment lawsuit that could have destroyed a senator's career. If anyone knew where the bodies were buried, it was Harold. The living room had been cleared of mourners, leaving only family and key associates. Sarah and David sat on the burgundy leather sofa, their hands intertwined. Marcus's business partner, James Crawford, occupied the wing-back chair near the window, his dark skin showing the strain of the past 3 days. He'd been Marcus's right hand for 15 years, the one man my husband had trusted completely, or so I'd thought. I settled into my usual chair, the one that gave me a clear view of everyone in the room, and studied their faces as Harold opened his briefcase. David seemed calm, almost expectant. Sarah looked appropriately solemn. James appeared genuinely grieved, but there was something else in his expression. Worry? Fear? "Before we begin," Harold said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I want you to know that Marcus updated his will quite recently, just 2 weeks ago, in fact. 2 weeks ago. The same time, Marcus had started acting strangely, making cryptic phone calls, working late into the night, looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be watching. I'd attributed it to stress from the new development project in Southeast D.C., the one that was supposed to be his legacy, a $1 billion revitalization effort that would transform the neighborhood where he'd grown up. The estate is substantial," Harold continued. "Valued at approximately $450 million, including real estate holdings, business interests, investment portfolios, and liquid assets." I felt David shift on the sofa beside me. $450 million was more than he'd expected, I realized, more than any of us had expected. "To my beloved wife, Victoria," Harold read, "I leave our family home and all personal effects, as well as $50 million in liquid assets and investment accounts." $50 million. It was generous by most standards, but it represented barely 10% of Marcus's wealth. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. "To my daughter, Sarah, I leave $100 million to be held in trust and administered by—" Harold paused, glancing at me over his glasses, "by her husband, David Morrison, until such time as she reaches the age of 40. Sarah gasped. "Administered by David? But I'm 35. I've been managing my own finances for—" "There's more," Harold said gently. "The remainder of the estate, including all business holdings and real estate investments, I leave to my business partner, James Crawford, with the stipulation that he continue the Southeast D.C. development project as planned." The silence that followed was deafening. James looked as shocked as I felt. $300 million plus the entire business empire, left not to family, but to an employee. "There must be some mistake," Sarah said, her voice tight with disbelief. "I'm afraid not." Harold's voice was carefully neutral. "Marcus was very specific about his wishes. He also left individual letters for each of you to be opened privately." He handed out sealed envelopes, cream-colored paper with Marcus's distinctive handwriting. Mine felt heavier than the others, and when I turned it over, I saw something that made my blood freeze. My name was written in blue ink, but underneath it, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a tiny mark, a small X that Marcus and I had used as a code during our early years in business, a signal that meant danger or trust no one. "If you'll excuse me," I said, standing abruptly, "I need some air." I walked out onto the terrace overlooking the grounds, my mind reeling. The will made no sense. Marcus would never have left his life's work to anyone but family, and he certainly wouldn't have put Sarah's inheritance under David's control. Something was very, very wrong. I tore open the envelope with trembling fingers. "Victoria, if you're reading this, then my suspicions were correct, and I'm already dead. I've discovered something that threatens everything we've built, and I fear my time is running out. The development project is not what it seems. David has been feeding information to our competitors, sabotaging deals, and positioning himself to take control of the company through Sarah. I have proof, but I couldn't confront him directly without putting you and Sarah in danger. The will Harold just read is a fake. I've hidden my real will in the greenhouse, along with evidence of David's betrayal. Trust James. He's the only one who knows the truth. If something happens to me, it won't be natural causes. David is more dangerous than we ever imagined. Protect yourself. Protect Sarah. And whatever you do, don't let him know that you know. I love you, Victoria. I always have. Marcus, P.S. Check your phone. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the letter. I pulled out my phone and saw a new message from Marcus's number. The greenhouse. Midnight. The truth is buried beneath the roses. I looked back through the glass doors at the living room where my family was still absorbing the shock of the will reading. David was comforting Sarah, his arm around her shoulders, his face a mask of concern. But now I could see what I'd missed before. The calculating gleam in his eyes, the way he seemed to be measuring everyone's reactions. My son-in-law wasn't just a gold digger. He was a killer. And he had no idea that my husband had outwitted him from beyond the grave. Chapter 4. The son-in-law I never knew. I forced myself to return to the living room, slipping the letter into my purse while arranging my features into an expression of stunned grief. Everyone was exactly where I'd left them, but the atmosphere had shifted. David was speaking in low, urgent tones to Sarah, while James sat apart staring at his unopened letter with an expression I couldn't read. "Victoria," David said as I entered, his voice pitched perfectly to convey concern and authority. "I know this is a shock for all of us, but I want you to know that Sarah and I will make sure you're taken care of. Family comes first." The audacity of it took my breath away. Here was a man who had just inherited control of my daughter's fortune and quite possibly murdered my husband to arrange it, offering to take care of me like I was some helpless widow who needed his charity. "That's very thoughtful of you, David." I kept my voice steady, though inside I was screaming. "Marcus always said you were like the son he never had." Something flickered in his eyes at that. Satisfaction, perhaps, or triumph barely contained. He was a great man, a mentor, really. I hope I can live up to his example. "I'm sure you will." I turned to James, who was finally opening his letter. "This must be overwhelming for you too, James. Marcus trusted you completely." James looked up from the letter, his dark eyes troubled. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't understand why he would do this. Leave everything to me instead of family. It doesn't make sense." "Grief rarely makes sense," David interjected smoothly. "But Marcus obviously saw something in you, James. He must have known you'd protect his legacy." I watched the interplay between them, noting how David seemed to be studying James's reaction. Was he worried about what the letter contained, or was he simply trying to gauge whether James would be a useful puppet or a potential threat? "Perhaps," I said carefully, "we should all take some time to process this. It's been a long, difficult day." "Of course." Harold Blackwood was already packing up his briefcase. "If you have any questions about the will or the transfer of assets, please don't hesitate to call. The legal process will take some time, of course, but how long?" David's question was sharp, urgent. Harold paused in his packing. "Well, probate can take anywhere from 6 months to a year, depending on the complexity of the estate. But as the administrator of Sarah's trust, and James as the primary beneficiary, you'll have access to operating accounts almost immediately." I filed that information away. Whatever David was planning, he needed quick access to Marcus's money. That suggested either desperation or a timeline I didn't yet understand. The gathering began to disperse. Harold left first, promising to be in touch about the legal formalities. James lingered, clearly wanting to speak with me privately, but David seemed determined not to leave us alone. "Mom," Sarah said, taking my hands in hers, "why don't you come stay with us for a few days? The house must feel so empty now." The invitation was clearly David's idea, though Sarah delivered it with genuine concern. He wanted to keep me close, under observation. The question was why. Was I a threat he needed to neutralize, or simply a loose end he needed to tie up? "Thank you, sweetheart, but I think I need to be here, in Marcus's space. It helps me feel closer to him." "Are you sure?" David's concern sounded genuine, but I could see the frustration beneath it. I hate the thought of you alone in this big house. I have the staff, and besides, I managed a weak smile, I'm not ready to leave him yet. Call it an old woman's foolishness. I wasn't old. 60 was the new 40 in our circles, but playing the fragile widow seemed like the safest role for now. Let David underestimate me. Let him think grief had made me weak and manageable. After they left, I walked through the house that had been my home for over 3 decades, seeing it with new eyes. How long had David been planning this? How many times had he sat at our dinner table, smiled at our family gatherings, played the devoted son-in-law while plotting Marcus's destruction? I thought back to the early days of their relationship. Sarah had met David at a charity gala 5 years ago, one of those glittering affairs where Washington's elite gathered to see and be seen while writing checks for fashionable causes. He'd been charming, well-educated, appropriately ambitious. His background had checked out: Harvard MBA, family money from Boston, a position at a respected investment firm. But now I wondered, how deep had we really dug? In our world, the right credentials and a charming smile could open any door. We'd been so pleased that Sarah had found someone who understood our world, who could be a true partner in the empire we'd built. We'd never considered that he might want to steal it. My phone buzzed. Another message from the dead. Don't trust the staff either. David's been here for years, long enough to buy loyalty. The greenhouse. 1 hour. Come alone. I looked around the familiar rooms, the antique furniture Marcus and I had collected over the years, the art we'd purchased on trips to Europe, the photographs documenting our rise from ambitious young couple to American royalty. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built with the man I'd loved for 37 years, was at risk. But Marcus hadn't gone quietly into that good night. Somehow, he'd anticipated this betrayal and prepared for it. The question was, what exactly had he prepared, and would it be enough to save what was left of our family? I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my bedroom now, and began to change into dark clothes, suitable for a midnight rendezvous with a ghost. If my husband was alive, I was going to get answers. If he was dead but had somehow arranged this elaborate posthumous communication, I was going to honor his last wishes. Either way, David Morrison was about to discover that Victoria Whitmore hadn't survived 40 years in Washington's power circles by being anyone's victim. The game was just beginning. Chapter 5. Messages from Beyond. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11:30 as I made my way through the darkened house toward the greenhouse. I dismissed the staff early, claiming exhaustion and a need for solitude. The house felt different in the darkness, larger, full of shadows that seemed to whisper secrets. I'd changed into black jeans and a dark sweater, my feet silent in soft-soled shoes. If someone was watching the house, they'd see nothing more than a grieving widow taking a late-night walk in her garden. But my heart was pounding like I was preparing for battle. The greenhouse stood at the far end of the property, a Victorian-era structure of glass and iron that Marcus had restored as an anniversary gift 15 years ago. I'd filled it with roses, dozens of varieties in every color, their blooms creating a riot of beauty and fragrance that had always been my sanctuary. Now it felt like a mausoleum. I used my key to unlock the door, the hinges creaking as I stepped inside. Moonlight filtered through the glass panels, casting everything in silver and shadow. The air was thick with the scent of roses and rich earth, familiar and comforting despite the circumstances. My phone showed 11:58, 2 minutes until midnight. I walked slowly between the raised beds, looking for anything out of place. The roses my husband's message had referenced were at the far end, a bed of deep red blooms that we'd planted together on our 20th anniversary. As I approached, I could see that the soil around several plants had been disturbed recently. At exactly midnight, my phone rang. Not a text this time, an actual call from Marcus's number. I stared at the screen for 3 rings before finding the courage to answer. Hello? Victoria. The voice was unmistakably my husband's, the same deep tone, the same slight rasp from decades of expensive cigars. Thank God you came. My knees nearly gave out. Marcus, how is this possible? It's a long story and we don't have much time. David could be watching. Are you alone? I spun around, suddenly aware of how exposed I was in the glass structure. Yes, Marcus, they buried you today. I saw your body. A sound that might have been laughter or might have been a sob came through the phone. You saw what they wanted you to see. David's been planning this for 2 years, Victoria. The funeral, the will, everything. But he made one mistake. He underestimated me. I don't understand. If you're alive, why didn't you... Because if I'd surfaced, if I'd confronted him directly, he would have killed Sarah next. Maybe you too. This was the only way to protect you while gathering the evidence we need to destroy him. I sank onto the small bench beside the rose bed, my mind reeling. What evidence? Marcus. What's really going on? David isn't who he claims to be. His real name is Daniel Morrison. He's a con artist who's been running long-term games on wealthy families for over a decade. The Boston background, the Harvard MBA, even his investment firm job, all carefully constructed lies. But we had him investigated when Sarah first got serious about him. With information he provided, names of references who were part of his network, academic records that were expertly forged, employment history that looked legitimate but was all smoke and mirrors. He's very, very good at what he does, Victoria. I thought back to David's courtship of Sarah, how smoothly he'd integrated into our lives, how perfectly he'd seemed to fit. What does he want? Everything. But not just our money. He's been selling information about our development projects to competitors, manipulating deals to benefit his real partners. The Southeast DC project alone is worth billions, and he's been positioning himself to steal it all. The will is exactly what Harold read. David forced me to sign it 3 weeks ago when he showed me photographs of you and Sarah with rifle crosshairs superimposed over your faces. He said if I didn't cooperate, you'd both have accidents. Very believable accidents. My blood turned to ice. He threatened to kill us? He's already killed, Victoria. Do you remember Jonathan Blackwood, Harold's nephew who worked at the law firm? I did remember him. A bright young lawyer who'd handled some routine business for us. He died in a car accident 6 months ago, brake failure on a mountain road. Jonathan discovered some irregularities in the documents David had us sign, legal papers that weren't quite what they seemed. He was going to bring his concerns to Harold when his brakes mysteriously failed. Oh my God, David is a predator. Victoria. He picks wealthy families, identifies the weak points, and then destroys them from within. We're not his first victims, and if we don't stop him, we won't be his last. I was quiet for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what Marcus was telling me. My son-in-law, the man I'd welcomed into my family, the man who shared a bed with my daughter, was not just a gold digger, but a killer. How are you alive? I finally asked. I saw the body. A homeless man from Southeast DC, someone David's people found who was roughly my size and age. They killed him, disfigured the face just enough to make identification difficult, but not so much as to raise suspicions. David has connections in the medical examiner's office. The identification was rushed, the autopsy superficial. But I identified you myself. You identified a black man of approximately my height and weight, with injuries that obscured his features. In your grief, you saw what you expected to see, what they wanted you to see. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity and precision. Where have you been? Hiding, gathering evidence, building a case that will destroy David and everyone working with him. But I needed him to think he'd won. The funeral had to be convincing, the will had to be read, the money had to start flowing. Only then would he get careless enough to make mistakes. What about Sarah? Does she know? A long pause. No. And that's the hardest part, Victoria. Our daughter loves him. She's completely under his spell. If we revealed the truth now without absolute proof, she might choose him over us. He was right. Sarah was intelligent and strong, but she was also in love. And love, I knew from experience, could make even the smartest woman believe the most obvious lies. What do you need me to do? Keep playing the grieving widow. Let David think he's in control. But watch him, Victoria. Document everything, every meeting, every phone call, every unusual transaction. The real evidence is buried here, under the roses we planted for our anniversary. Tomorrow night, when it's safe, dig exactly 3 feet down from the base of the largest plant. You'll find everything you need to destroy him. Marcus. But the line had gone dead. I sat alone in the greenhouse, surrounded by the roses that had witnessed our love story and now held the key to our revenge. My husband was alive, scarred, hunted, but alive. David Morrison. The charming son-in-law I'd trusted with my daughter's happiness was a monster who'd murdered innocents and threatened my family, and I was the only one who knew the truth. Tomorrow, I would begin the most important performance of my life, playing the helpless widow while secretly preparing for war. But tonight, I would sit among the roses and grieve, not for my husband who lived, but for the daughter who had no idea she was sleeping beside her father's would-be killer. The game had indeed just begun, but David Morrison was about to learn that he'd made a fatal error. He'd underestimated Victoria Whitmore. Chapter 6, The Performance Begins. I barely slept that night, my mind churning with everything Marcus had told me. Every creak of the house made me wonder if David had decided I was a threat, if he was coming to stage another accident. By the time dawn broke, I'd mentally rehearsed my widow's performance a dozen times and planned my approach to the evidence buried in the greenhouse. The morning brought visitors, more well-meaning friends offering condolences, business associates discussing the transition of power, and a steady stream of phone calls from people who wanted to position themselves advantageously in the post-Marcus landscape. I played my part perfectly, accepting sympathy with dignified grace while my mind calculated and planned. Sarah arrived around noon with David, bringing lunch and concern for my well-being. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, and I had to fight the urge to pull her into my arms and tell her the truth. Instead, I watched David carefully, looking for cracks in his facade now that I knew what lay beneath it. He was very good. The concerned son-in-law, the grieving protege, the man suddenly burdened with enormous responsibility. But now I could see what I'd missed before, how he positioned himself to overhear every conversation, how his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging and calculating. "Mom, you look terrible," Sarah said, setting containers of soup on the kitchen counter. "Are you sleeping at all?" "Not much," I admitted truthfully. "I keep expecting to hear his key in the door." "Maybe you should see Dr. Richardson. He could prescribe something to help you rest." David nodded sympathetically. "Sarah's right. You need to take care of yourself, Victoria. Marcus would want that." The bastard. He was actually using my supposed grief over the husband he'd tried to murder as a way to show his caring nature. I'll consider it. Right now, I'm just trying to understand everything. The will, the business arrangements. It's all so sudden. "That's why I'm here," David said, his voice gentle but firm. "Harold and I have been going over the legal requirements for the transition. There's quite a bit to handle. The transfer of assets, the business operations, decisions about the Southeast DC project." "So soon?" "Unfortunately, yes. The development has investors, contractors, deadlines. We can't afford to let everything stagnate while we grieve. Marcus wouldn't have wanted that." Again, with invoking Marcus's wishes. I wondered if he knew how close he was dancing to the edge of my self-control. "What kind of decisions?" I asked. David pulled out a leather portfolio, spreading documents across the kitchen table. Well, there are some immediate funding needs. The contractors require progress payments, and there are some regulatory hurdles that need addressing. Marcus had been working on those personally, but now... He let the sentence hang, conveying the weight of responsibility that had fallen on his shoulders. I scanned the documents, noting names and figures while maintaining the expression of a confused widow, trying to understand business matters beyond her comprehension. "It's all so complicated," I murmured. "Marcus always handled these things." "I know, and I don't want you to worry about any of it." David's hand covered mine in a gesture that might have seemed comforting if I didn't know he was a killer. "James and I will handle everything. You just focus on healing." James. I wondered how much Marcus's business partner knew, whose side he was really on. The letter he'd received yesterday had clearly shaken him, but was it because he was part of David's conspiracy, or because he was as much in the dark as the rest of us? "Have you spoken with James today?" I asked. "Briefly. He's struggling with the responsibility. I think he's having second thoughts about Marcus's decision to leave him the business." "What kind of second thoughts?" David exchanged a look with Sarah before answering. "He's been suggesting that maybe the will should be challenged, that Marcus wasn't thinking clearly in his final weeks, that the estate should go to family instead of an employee." This was news, and it changed my understanding of the dynamics at play. If James was pushing back against the will, it suggested he might be an ally rather than an enemy, or it might mean David was preparing to eliminate him as well. "What do you think?" I asked carefully. "I think Marcus knew exactly what he was doing," David said firmly. He trusted James to carry on his vision for the Southeast project, but more than that, he trusted me to help guide the family through this transition. We need to honor his wishes, even if they're not what we expected. Sarah nodded, her faith in her husband absolute. "David's right, Mom. Daddy must have had his reasons." "I suppose." I gathered the documents together, noting which ones David seemed most eager to have signed. I should probably read through all of this more carefully before making any decisions. "Of course," David said, but I caught the flash of impatience in his eyes. "Take all the time you need, but keep in mind that every day we delay costs money and momentum. The Southeast project represents Marcus's legacy. We can't let it fail because we were too cautious." After they left, I sat in Marcus's study and really examined the documents David had brought. Most were routine business matters, but several stood out. Transfer authorizations that would give David significant control over operating accounts, development contracts that favored companies I'd never heard of, and loan agreements with terms that seemed unusually harsh. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus's number. "He's moving faster than expected. Be ready to dig tonight. And Victoria, trust James. He's trying to protect you." I looked up James Crawford's address and drove to his Georgetown townhouse that evening, taking a circuitous route and checking my mirrors to make sure I wasn't followed. If Marcus was right, if James was an ally, then I needed to know what he knew and what he suspected. James answered the door himself, his face showing surprise and concern when he saw me. "Mrs. Whitmore, is everything all right?" "May I come in? I need to talk to you about Marcus." He led me to his study, a smaller version of Marcus's office but just as carefully appointed. "Would you like something to drink? Coffee? Something stronger?" "Coffee would be good." While he prepared it, I studied the framed photographs on his desk, images of his family, his degrees from Howard University and Wharton, pictures of him and Marcus at various business functions over the years. They'd been true partners, I realized, more than just employer and employee. "James," I said when he returned with the coffee, "what did Marcus's letter say?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his cup. "It said things that don't make sense, things that would sound crazy if I said them out loud." "Try me." James looked up, meeting my eyes. He said David wasn't who he claimed to be, that he was dangerous. That if something happened to Marcus, I should protect you and Sarah. He paused. Mrs. Whitmore, did Marcus seem different to you in the weeks before he died? Yes. Paranoid. Worried. Working late. Making strange phone calls. I leaned forward. James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think Marcus died of natural causes? The coffee cup trembled in his hands. No, I don't. And that terrifies me because if I'm right, if Marcus was murdered, then we're all in danger. I made a decision that could have gotten us both killed. James, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to listen. And I told him everything. About the text messages, the phone call in the greenhouse, Marcus's revelation about David's true identity. I watched his face cycle through disbelief, shock, and finally, a grim acceptance that made my heart sink. It makes sense, he said quietly when I finished. God help me, it all makes sense. The business deals that didn't quite add up, the competitors who seemed to know our strategies before we implemented them, the way David always positioned himself to overhear confidential conversations. What else do you know? The Southeast Project. Marcus was having second thoughts about it in the final weeks. He discovered that some of our supposed investors were shell companies, entities that existed on paper but had no real substance. When he started investigating, that's when he became different. Do you have any evidence? Some. Financial records that don't add up. Correspondence that Marcus asked me to keep in a separate file. Nothing definitive, but enough to raise questions. He stood, walking to his wall safe. I've been keeping it here, thinking I was being paranoid. Now I think I was being smart. He pulled out a thick folder and spread the contents across his desk. Bank records, email printouts, photographs of documents, a paper trail that painted a picture of systematic fraud and deception. Look at this, James said, pointing to a series of wire transfers, money flowing from our operating accounts to these shell companies, then disappearing into offshore accounts. David authorized all of these transactions, claiming they were for project expenses. I studied the records, my business experience helping me understand the sophisticated nature of the theft. How much? Almost everything. Maybe $50 million left in accounts they couldn't access immediately. The house, some personal assets, but the business empire. Marcus's voice was heavy with loss. $400 million, Victoria. Gone. I should have been devastated. I should have collapsed under the weight of losing everything we'd built together. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Marcus, I said, squeezing his hand, do you remember what we had when we got married? Each other, and about $20,000 between us. And we built an empire from that. We can do it again. He looked at me with wonder, the same expression he'd worn 37 years ago when I'd agreed to marry a young man with more ambition than assets. You're not angry? I'm furious, but not at losing money, at losing time. At David stealing days and weeks and months from our lives together. Money we can replace. Time we can't. Agent Chen cleared her throat delicately. If it helps, the FBI's Asset Forfeiture Division is very good at tracking down stolen funds. Morrison's network was sophisticated but not invisible. We'll recover what we can. That would be welcome, Marcus said. But Victoria's right. We've started over before. Over the next several hours, as FBI technicians processed the crime scene and agents took our statements, the full scope of Morrison's operation became clear. He hadn't just targeted our family. We were part of a web that included at least 8 other wealthy families across the country. The investigation would take years to unravel completely, but our part in it was finished. Epilogue. 6 months later. The new house was smaller than the estate we'd lost, a comfortable colonial in Georgetown that cost a fraction of what we'd once considered modest expenses. But it felt like home in a way the mansion never had, perhaps because we'd chosen it together. Without the weight of expectations or the need to project power and success. Marcus was officially alive again thanks to creative paperwork and a sympathetic federal judge who understood the unique circumstances of the case. The death certificate had been voided, the funeral deemed a necessary deception in a federal investigation. It had caused quite a stir in Washington social circles. The resurrection of Marcus Whitmore was the gossip of the season. Sarah was in therapy, working through the trauma of discovering that her marriage had been built on lies and manipulation. She'd filed for divorce the moment she learned the truth, but the healing would take much longer. For now, she was staying with us, rebuilding her sense of trust in her own judgment. "Mom?" She appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. "There's an article you should see." The headline made my breath catch. "FBI arrests notorious con man in Miami sting operation." David Morrison's photograph stared back at me from the front page, but he looked different again, this time older, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. The article detailed his capture during an attempted infiltration of another wealthy family, his arrest facilitated by evidence gathered during the Whitmore investigation. "He was targeting a pharmaceutical heiress," Sarah said quietly, "a woman about my age whose father had recently died. Thank God they caught him before he could do to her what he did to us." Sarah's voice was steady, but I could see the pain in her eyes. "Agent Chen called this morning. Morrison's network is completely dismantled. 17 arrests, including 3 other infiltrators who were in the middle of long-term cons." I set down the newspaper and pulled my daughter into a hug. "It's really over." "The criminal case, yes. The emotional healing." She managed a weak smile. "That's going to take longer." Marcus joined us in the kitchen, looking more rested than he had in months. The stress of living in hiding, of watching his family from a distance while unable to protect them, had taken its toll. But gradually, he was becoming himself again. "Any word from the asset recovery team?" I asked. "Better than expected. They've traced about $200 million to accounts Morrison thought were untouchable. It'll take years to work through the legal process, but we'll get most of it back eventually." It was more than we'd dared hope for, but the money felt less important now. What mattered was that we were together, that the threat was gone, that our family, damaged but intact, could begin to heal. "There's something else," Marcus said, pulling a letter from his pocket, from James. James Crawford had started his own consulting firm with the $50 million Marcus had left him in the real will, the one hidden beneath the fake documents Morrison had forced him to sign. He'd offered to return it all when the truth came out, but Marcus had insisted he keep it. James had been a loyal partner for 15 years. He deserved to build something of his own. "He wants to know if we'd be interested in a new project," Marcus continued. "A smaller development in Southeast DC, community-focused, affordable housing with retail spaces for local businesses." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd discuss it with my partner." I looked around the kitchen, smaller than what we'd been accustomed to, but filled with morning sunlight and the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of my daughter's laughter as she read the newspaper's account of Morrison's capture. "Your partner says yes," I told him, "but on one condition." "What's that?" "No more secrets, no more hidden plans or protected information. If we're going to rebuild, we do it together, all of us." Marcus smiled, the same smile that had won my heart when we were both young and poor and convinced we could conquer the world. "Deal." Sarah looked up from the newspaper. "Does this mean I can help? I've been thinking about what I want to do with my life, and real estate development sounds interesting." "It means," Marcus said, "that the Whitmore family is back in business, older, wiser, and considerably more careful about who we trust." Outside, Georgetown buzzed with its usual morning energy, tourists heading to museums, government workers hurrying to meetings, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Once I might have looked down on such mundane existence from the heights of wealth and power. Now it looked like freedom. The roses in our small garden weren't as elaborate as the ones that had hidden Marcus's evidence, but they bloomed just as beautifully. I'd planted them myself, with my own hands, in soil that belonged to us, not as symbols of an empire built for others to admire, but as a promise of new growth, new beginnings, new chances to get things right. 6 months ago, I'd stood beside what I thought was my husband's grave, receiving condolences from people who saw our tragedy as an opportunity for advancement. Today, I stood in a kitchen filled with sunlight and love, and the voices of my family, planning a future that was smaller in scope, but infinitely richer in meaning. David Morrison, Daniel Kowalski, whatever his real name was, would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His network was destroyed, his victims could finally have justice, and his reign of terror was over. But perhaps the greatest victory was this. He'd tried to steal our legacy, our fortune, our very lives. Instead, he'd given us something infinitely more valuable. He'd reminded us what really mattered. Marcus reached for my hand across the breakfast table, the same gesture he'd made thousands of times over 37 years of marriage. But this time, it felt like a miracle. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I'm thinking," I said, "that it's a beautiful day to be alive." And for the first time in months, that was absolutely, completely true. The end author's note. At My Husband's Funeral explores themes of trust, betrayal, and the resilience of family bonds in the face of elaborate deception. While the criminal network depicted is fictional, it draws inspiration from real-world cases of long-term financial fraud and the sophisticated methods used by modern con artists to infiltrate and exploit wealthy families. The story serves as both entertainment and a reminder that predators often wear the most convincing masks and that true wealth lies not in material possessions, but in the relationships we build and the love we share. Epilogue. 6 months later. The new house was smaller than the estate we'd lost, a comfortable colonial in Georgetown that cost a fraction of what we'd once considered modest expenses. But it felt like home in a way the mansion never had, perhaps because we'd chosen it together without the weight of expectations or the need to project power and success. Marcus was officially alive again, thanks to creative paperwork and a sympathetic federal judge who understood the unique circumstances of the case. The death certificate had been voided, the funeral deemed a necessary deception in a federal investigation. It had caused quite a stir in Washington social circles. The resurrection of Marcus Whitmore was the gossip of the season. Sarah was in therapy, working through the trauma of discovering that her marriage had been built on lies and manipulation. She'd filed for divorce the moment she learned the truth, but the healing would take much longer. For now, she was staying with us, rebuilding her sense of trust in her own judgment. "Mom?" She appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. "There's an article you should see." The headline made my breath catch. FBI arrests notorious con man in Miami sting operation. David Morrison's photograph stared back at me from the front page, but he looked different again, this time older with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. The article detailed his capture during an attempted infiltration of another wealthy family, his arrest facilitated by evidence gathered during the Whitmore investigation. "He was targeting a pharmaceutical heiress," Sarah said quietly, "a woman about my age whose father had recently died. Thank God they caught him before he could do to her what he did to us." Sarah's voice was steady, but I could see the pain in her eyes. "Agent Chen called this morning. Morrison's network is completely dismantled. 17 arrests, including 3 other infiltrators who were in the middle of long-term cons." I set down the newspaper and pulled my daughter into a hug. "It's really over." "The criminal case, yes. The emotional healing." She managed a weak smile. "That's going to take longer." Marcus joined us in the kitchen, looking more rested than he had in months. The stress of living in hiding, of watching his family from a distance while unable to protect them, had taken its toll. But gradually, he was becoming himself again. Any word from the asset recovery team? I asked. Better than expected. They've traced about $200 million to accounts Morrison thought were untouchable. It'll take years to work through the legal process, but we'll get most of it back eventually. It was more than we'd dared hope for, but the money felt less important now. What mattered was that we were together, that the threat was gone, that our family, damaged but intact, could begin to heal. There's something else, Marcus said, pulling a letter from his pocket. From James. James Crawford had started his own consulting firm with the $50 million Marcus had left him in the real will, the one hidden beneath the fake documents Morrison had forced him to sign. He'd offered to return it all when the truth came out, but Marcus had insisted he keep it. James had been a loyal partner for 15 years. He deserved to build something of his own. He wants to know if we'd be interested in a new project, Marcus continued. A smaller development in Southeast D.C., community-focused, affordable housing with retail spaces for local businesses. What did you tell him? That I'd discuss it with my partner. I looked around the kitchen, smaller than what we'd been accustomed to, but filled with morning sunlight and the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of my daughter's laughter as she read the newspaper's account of Morrison's capture. Your partner says yes, I told him, but on one condition. What's that? No more secrets, no more hidden plans or protected information. If we're going to rebuild, we do it together, all of us. Marcus smiled, the same smile that had won my heart when we were both young and poor and convinced we could conquer the world. Deal. Sarah looked up from the newspaper. Does this mean I can help? I've been thinking about what I want to do with my life, and real estate development sounds interesting. It means, Marcus said, that the Whitmore family is back in business, older, wiser, and considerably more careful about who we trust. Outside, Georgetown buzzed with its usual morning energy. Tourists heading to museums, government workers hurrying to meetings, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Once I might have looked down on such mundane existence from the heights of wealth and power. Now it looked like freedom. The roses in our small garden weren't as elaborate as the ones that had hidden Marcus's evidence, but they bloomed just as beautifully. I'd planted them myself with my own hands in soil that belonged to us, not as symbols of an empire built for others to admire, but as a promise of new growth, new beginnings, new chances to get things right. 6 months ago, I'd stood beside what I thought was my husband's grave, receiving condolences from people who saw our tragedy as an opportunity for advancement. Today, I stood in a kitchen filled with sunlight and love and the voices of my family, planning a future that was smaller in scope, but infinitely richer in meaning. David Morrison, Daniel Kowalski, whatever his real name was, would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His network was destroyed, his victims could finally have justice, and his reign of terror was over. But perhaps the greatest victory was this. He'd tried to steal our legacy, our fortune, our very lives. Instead, he'd given us something infinitely more valuable. He'd reminded us what really mattered. Marcus reached for my hand across the breakfast table, the same gesture he'd made thousands of times over 37 years of marriage. But this time, it felt like a miracle. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I'm thinking," I said, "that it's a beautiful day to be alive." And for the first time in months, that was absolutely, completely true. The end author's note. At My Husband's Funeral explores themes of trust, betrayal, and the resilience of family bonds in the face of elaborate deception. While the criminal network depicted is fictional, it draws inspiration from real-world cases of long-term financial fraud and the sophisticated methods used by modern con artists to infiltrate and exploit wealthy families. The story serves as both entertainment and a reminder that predators often wear the most convincing masks, and that true wealth lies not in material possessions, but in the relationships we build and the love we share. 30 million so far, and that's just what I've been able to trace. Why didn't you say something to Marcus? I tried, but every time I brought up concerns, David was there with explanations. Regulatory compliance, international tax structures, investment opportunities. He made it all sound legitimate, and Marcus trusted him. We spent the next hour going through the evidence, building a timeline of David's crimes. But as compelling as it wasn't enough. Financial irregularities could be explained away by a good lawyer. We needed something more concrete, more damning. Marcus said he had evidence, I told James, hidden in my greenhouse. I'm supposed to retrieve it tonight. Then we retrieve it together. If David is as dangerous as Marcus believed, you shouldn't be alone. At midnight, James and I made our way through my darkened garden to the greenhouse. He carried a small spade while I held a flashlight, both of us moving as quietly as possible. The roses seemed to glow in the moonlight, their fragrance heavy in the cool night air. I found the largest plant in the anniversary bed and began measuring 3 feet from its base. The soil was soft, recently watered, and the spade bit deep with each thrust. 3 feet down, exactly as Marcus had said, my shovel hit something solid. It was a waterproof container, roughly the size of a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in plastic, were documents, photographs, and what appeared to be audio recording devices. The first document was a detailed dossier on David Morrison, or rather, Daniel Morrison. Photographs showed him with different women in various cities, police reports from investigations into suspicious deaths, and a timeline that revealed a pattern stretching back over a decade. Boston, Chicago, Miami. Each city had a wealthy widow or heir who died under mysterious circumstances after becoming involved with the charming, well-educated David Morrison. In each case, he'd inherited or gained control of substantial assets before disappearing and re-emerging in a new city with a new identity. Jesus Christ, James whispered, studying the photographs. He's a serial killer. The audio recordings were even more damning. Marcus had somehow managed to record conversations between David and unknown conspirators, planning not just the theft of our assets, but the systematic elimination of anyone who might threaten their operation. Once the old man is gone, David's voice was clear on the recording, we move fast. The wife won't be a problem. She's already showing signs of being overwhelmed. A few months of grief. Maybe some medication for depression, and she'll sign whatever we put in front of her. And if she doesn't, the second voice was unfamiliar, gravelly. Then she has an accident, heart attack, stroke, something believable for a woman her age. The daughter inherits everything, and I control the daughter. What about Crawford? He's getting suspicious, asking too many questions. We may need to handle him too. My hands were shaking as I listened to them discuss our murders as casually as planning a dinner party. These weren't just thieves, they were predators who viewed human life as merely an obstacle to wealth. The final piece of evidence was a detailed breakdown of David's network, names, locations, bank accounts, and most importantly, his real identity and background. Daniel Morrison was a former investment banker who'd embezzled millions from his firm before disappearing and reinventing himself as a freelance predator. We have to go to the police, James said. With what? Recordings that might not be admissible in court? Financial records that David could claim were legitimate business transactions? And meanwhile, he has access to hundreds of millions of dollars and a network of killers. James was quiet, understanding the impossible position we were in. Then what do we do? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Get out, now. David knows you were at James's house tonight. Run. We looked at each other in terror, then began quickly repacking the evidence. But as we prepared to leave the greenhouse, I saw car headlights turning into my driveway. Too late, I whispered. We were trapped. Chapter 7. The hunter becomes hunted. The headlights swept across the garden as the car pulled up to the main house. Through the glass walls of the greenhouse, James and I crouched among the roses, watching as two figures emerged from a black sedan. Even in the darkness, I recognized David's silhouette. My phone vibrated with another text from Marcus. Service tunnel behind the potting bench leads to the old root cellar. I'd forgotten about the tunnel, a relic from the estate's previous owner who'd been paranoid about nuclear war in the 1960s. Marcus and I had discovered it during renovations, but had never bothered to explore it fully. Now it might be our salvation. "This way," I whispered to James, leading him to the back of the greenhouse where a potting bench sat against the rear wall. Together, we moved it aside, revealing a wooden panel that I hadn't noticed in decades. It opened to reveal a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness. "You first," James said, his voice tight with fear. I crawled into the tunnel, grateful for the dark clothes I'd worn. The space was cramped, barely wide enough for an adult, and I had to fight claustrophobia as we inched forward through the musty darkness. Behind me, I could hear James breathing heavily, the evidence container scraping against the tunnel walls. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we emerged into a stone-walled cellar beneath the estate's old carriage house. A rickety wooden staircase led up to ground level, and I could see moonlight filtering through dirty windows. "Where are we?" James whispered. "About 200 yards from the main house. We can get to the cars from here without being seen." But as we climbed the stairs, I heard the sound of engines starting. Through the grimy windows, I could see more vehicles arriving, at least 3 cars, which meant David hadn't come alone. My phone buzzed again. "They've surrounded the house. Emergency exit through the stable. Horse trail leads to Old Mill Road." Even in death, or apparent death, Marcus was still protecting me. The stable was another 100 yards away, but the intervening space was heavily wooded. If we were careful, we might make it unseen. "James," I said, "how well do you know these grounds?" "Well enough. I've been to enough of your parties over the years." "Good. We're going to the stable. Stay low, move tree to tree, and for God's sake, don't make any noise." We slipped out of the carriage house and into the woods. The moon provided just enough light to navigate by, but also enough to make us visible if we weren't careful. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot, every rustle of leaves like a siren announcing our presence. Halfway to the stable, we heard voices from the direction of the greenhouse. "They were here," David's voice carried clearly in the night air. "The soil's been disturbed. They found it." "How much did they get?" The gravelly voice from the recording. "Everything, probably. Marcus was thorough. I'll give the bastard that." "So what's the play?" "We find them before they can use it. They can't have gone far." I grabbed James's arm and pulled him behind a massive oak tree as flashlight beams began sweeping through the woods. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. "Split up," David ordered. "Check the house first, then expand the search. And remember, we need this to look like a home invasion gone wrong. No evidence, no witnesses." The casual way he discussed our murders made my blood freeze. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. We waited until the voices moved away, then continued toward the stable. The building loomed ahead, dark and seemingly empty. But as we approached, I saw a faint light in one of the stalls. Marcus stepped out of the shadows. Seeing him alive after attending his funeral, after grieving his death for days, was like being struck by lightning. He looked thinner than I remembered, his hair grayer, but his eyes held the same intelligence and determination that had first attracted me 40 years ago. "Victoria." He pulled me into his arms, and for a moment the terror of the last few hours faded away. "Thank God you're safe." "Marcus, how—" "Later. Right now, we need to move. David's people are good. But they don't know these grounds like we do." He led us through the stable to a tack room where 3 horses stood saddled and ready. "The trail leads to Old Mill Road. There's a car waiting there, someone I trust." "Who?" "Margaret Ashford." I stared at him in shock. "Margaret? But she's—" Not what she seems. Her husband's committee has been investigating financial crimes connected to the Southeast Development Project. She's been helping me gather evidence for months. The idea of Margaret Ashford as an undercover federal investigator was almost as shocking as discovering my husband was alive, but there was no time to process it fully. "Can you still ride?" Marcus asked James, who nodded grimly. We mounted quickly, Marcus leading the way along a trail I hadn't used in years. Behind us, I could hear shouts as David's men discovered our escape route. But horses could go, places cars couldn't, and Marcus knew every inch of these woods. The ride took 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. Every sound made me expect gunfire. Every shadow could have hidden an ambush. But finally, we emerged onto Old Mill Road, where a nondescript sedan waited with its engine running. Margaret Ashford sat behind the wheel, but this wasn't the society matron I knew. She wore dark clothing and moved with the efficiency of someone trained in surveillance and evasion. "Get in," she said tersely. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they realize where you went." As we drove away from the estate that had been my home for 3 decades, I finally allowed myself to believe we might survive this. But our escape was only the beginning. David Morrison, or Daniel Morrison, still controlled my daughter's fortune, still held power over the business empire Marcus had built, and Sarah was still sleeping beside a killer. "Where are we going?" I asked Margaret. "Safe house. FBI's been working this case for 2 years, ever since the pattern emerged. You're not Morrison's first victims, but if we do this right, you'll be his last." In the back seat, Marcus took my hand. "I'm sorry, Victoria. Sorry for putting you through this, for letting you think I was dead, but it was the only way to protect you and gather the evidence we needed." "How long have you known?" "About David?" "I started suspecting something 6 months ago when Jonathan Blackwood came to me with concerns about some of our legal documents. When Jonathan died, I knew it wasn't an accident. I started my own investigation, and the deeper I dug, the more horrifying it became." James leaned forward from the back seat. "How many others?" "At least 12 families over the past decade," Margaret answered. "Dozens of deaths, hundreds of millions stolen. Morrison's network spans multiple states, multiple identities. They're very, very good at what they do." "But you're better," I said, hoping it was true. "We're about to find out, because tomorrow we spring the trap that will either destroy Daniel Morrison or get us all killed." As we drove through the Virginia countryside toward an uncertain future, I thought about Sarah, asleep in bed beside the man who'd murdered her father, or tried to. She'd wake up tomorrow and discover that everything she believed about her life was a lie. But better a living father and a shattered illusion than a dead family and a stolen legacy. The war for our survival was just beginning. Chapter 8, The FBI's Gambit. The safe house turned out to be a modest suburban home in Arlington, the kind of place that blended invisibly into middle-class America. But the moment we stepped inside, I could see it was anything but ordinary. Communications equipment filled one bedroom, surveillance monitors lined the walls, and the windows were covered with material that looked bulletproof. "Welcome to our home away from home," Margaret said, dropping her society matron facade completely. "I'm Agent Margaret Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I've been undercover in Washington society for 3 years, investigating a network of sophisticated con artists targeting wealthy families." "Chen?" I stared at her, trying to reconcile this revelation with the woman I'd known for a decade. "Margaret Ashford is my cover identity. The real Margaret Ashford died in a car accident in Seattle 5 years ago. No family, no close friends. Perfect for assumption. Her husband knows, of course. Senator Ashford has been cooperating with our investigation." She led us to a conference room where files covered every surface. Photographs, financial records, surveillance reports, and crime scene photos created a mosaic of horror that made my stomach turn. David's face appeared in dozens of images, but he looked different in each one. Different hair color, different style of dress, sometimes even different apparent age. Daniel Morrison is a chameleon, Agent Chen explained. Real name Daniel Kowalski, former investment banker turned serial killer. He and his network have perfected the long-term infiltration con. They identify wealthy families, particularly those with unmarried heirs. And then Morrison inserts himself into their lives. How long does he usually take? James asked. Anywhere from 18 months to 5 years, depending on the complexity of the target's finances. Your family was particularly challenging because Marcus was so hands-on with the business operations. Marcus studied the photographs with the detached focus of a man planning war. How many people are in his network? At least 20 that we've identified. Forgers, hackers, muscle, other infiltrators. They operate like a sophisticated criminal corporation, highly organized, well-funded, and absolutely ruthless. I picked up one of the crime scene photos, a wealthy widow from Chicago who died of an apparent heart attack in her home. But the FBI report noted unusual bruising, consistent with manual strangulation. Why haven't you arrested them? Because until now, we've never had enough evidence to prosecute. Morrison is careful. He uses different identities, operates in different jurisdictions, and always has plausible explanations for suspicious deaths. Financial fraud is hard to prove when the victim is dead and the perpetrator has legal documents supporting his claims. But now you have Marcus, James said, a living witness who can testify to Morrison's threats and actions. Exactly. But more than that, we have the opportunity to catch him in the act. Morrison thinks Marcus is dead and that he's successfully taken control of the Whitmore fortune. If we play this right, we can get him to incriminate himself and reveal his entire network. Agent Chen pulled out a detailed map of the Whitmore estate. Tomorrow morning, Morrison will discover that you've escaped. He'll be panicked, desperate, and likely to make mistakes. That's when we move. What's the plan? Marcus asked. You stay dead. Officially, you're still Marcus Whitmore, deceased businessman, but we're going to let Morrison know that Victoria and James have evidence of his crimes and are planning to go to the authorities. Using us as bait, I said. Using you as bait, she confirmed, but protected bait. We'll have surveillance teams, backup agents, and extraction plans. The goal is to get Morrison to reveal his network while attempting to silence you permanently. The audacity of it took my breath away. And if something goes wrong, then a lot of very dangerous people remain free to kill again. Marcus was studying the surveillance photos of our estate. What about Sarah? She's still in danger. We're monitoring her. Morrison won't hurt her as long as he believes he controls her inheritance. But once we move against him, she becomes a liability. Then we get her out first. How? She trusts Morrison completely. If we approach her directly, she might warn him. It was James who provided the solution. Business emergency, something that requires her immediate presence in New York or Los Angeles. She'll go if she thinks it's important enough. Can you arrange that convincingly? I have contacts at several investment firms who owe Marcus favors, a merger negotiation, an acquisition opportunity, something that would realistically require the heiress to the Whitmore fortune to be present immediately. Agent Chen nodded approvingly. Do it, but carefully. Morrison has to believe it's legitimate or he'll smell the trap. We spent the next several hours planning every detail. James would call Sarah early in the morning with news of an urgent merger opportunity that required her presence in Los Angeles. Agent Chen's people would provide transportation and protection once she was away from Morrison. Meanwhile, I would return to the estate, accompanied by hidden FBI protection, and wait for Morrison to make his move. He'll come after you, Agent Chen warned, probably within 24 hours of discovering you have the evidence. We'll be ready. What if he decides to cut his losses and run instead? He won't. There's too much money at stake, and Morrison's profile suggests he's a narcissist who can't stand being outsmarted. He'll want to tie up loose ends personally. At 3 in the morning, Agent Chen's team drove me back to within a mile of the estate. I would walk the rest of the way, using a path that would make it appear I'd been hiding in the woods all night. The story would be that James and I had fled when Morrison arrived, spent the night in the forest, and that James had then left to contact the authorities while I returned to the house. "Remember?" Agent Chen said as I prepared to leave the car. "Act scared but defiant. You're a woman who's discovered her son-in-law is a killer, but you're not sure what to do about it. Confused, frightened, but determined to protect your family. That won't require much acting. Good. Natural reactions are always more convincing than performed ones." The walk back to the estate through the pre-dawn darkness was one of the longest of my life. Every shadow could have hidden one of Morrison's people. Every sound could have been the prelude to an attack. But I made it to the house without incident, slipping inside through the kitchen door I'd left unlocked. The house showed signs of the previous night's search. Furniture moved, drawers opened, papers scattered. Morrison's people had been thorough, but not destructive. They'd been looking for evidence, not sending a message. I went upstairs and showered, changing into fresh clothes and trying to look like a woman who'd spent a terrifying night hiding in the woods. Then I sat in Marcus's study and waited for the phone to ring. It rang at 7:30. "Victoria?" David's voice was carefully modulated, expressing concern and relief. "Thank God. Sarah and I have been worried sick. We came by last night and found the house torn apart. What happened?" "Burglars," I said, letting my voice shake. "James and I heard them breaking in. We ran into the woods and hid until they left." "Are you hurt? Where's James?" He went to call the police. "David, they took things from Marcus's office. Financial records, business documents. I'm scared." "I'm coming over right now. Don't touch anything until the police arrive." "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you." The lie tasted like acid in my mouth, but it was necessary. Morrison needed to believe he was still in control, still the trusted son-in-law coming to rescue the helpless widow. But as I hung up the phone, I wondered if Agent Chen's plan would really work. Morrison had survived and prospered for over a decade by being smarter than his victims and more ruthless than his enemies. In a few hours, I would discover whether the FBI was as clever as they believed, or whether I'd just signed my own death warrant. The endgame was about to begin. Chapter 9: The Trap Springs. David arrived within 30 minutes, accompanied by Sarah and 2 men I didn't recognize. He introduced them as private security consultants, hired to protect the family in the wake of the break-in. They looked more like soldiers than bodyguards, hard faces, alert eyes, and the kind of physical conditioning that suggested violence was a professional tool. "Oh, Mom," Sarah said, pulling me into a fierce hug. "I'm so sorry. This must have been terrifying." "It was," I said truthfully, "but I'm more worried about what they were looking for. Why would burglars want business documents?" David exchanged a look with his security consultants. "They probably thought financial records might contain account information, passwords, that sort of thing. Modern burglars are more sophisticated than people realize." One of the men, David had introduced him as Stevens, was already examining the signs of the search. "Looks professional. They knew what they were looking for and where to find it." "Which is strange," I said carefully, "because they went straight to Marcus's private safe. How would random burglars know about that?" Again, that exchange of looks. David was calculating, trying to determine how much I knew and how much I suspected. "Where's James?" he asked. I'd like to hear his account of what happened. He said he had urgent business in New York, something about investors getting nervous after Marcus's death. It wasn't entirely a lie. James was indeed on his way to New York, though his business involved setting up the fake merger opportunity that would get Sarah safely away from her husband. "He should have coordinated with me," David said, and I caught the edge in his voice. "I'm administering Sarah's trust now. All major business decisions need my approval. I'm sure he'll contact you once he's sorted things out." My phone rang. Perfect timing. It was James, calling from what I hoped was a secure location. Victoria, thank God you're safe. Listen, something urgent has come up. The Blackstone Group wants to meet with Sarah about a possible merger with their entertainment division. It could be worth hundreds of millions, but they need an answer by tomorrow. I don't understand. They want to merge their film and television holdings with our media properties. It's exactly the kind of diversification Marcus had been considering. But Sarah needs to be in Los Angeles by tonight for the preliminary negotiations. David had moved close enough to overhear, his face tight with suspicion. He held out his hand for the phone. "James, it's David. What's this about a merger?" I couldn't hear James's response, but David's expression grew increasingly skeptical as he listened. "I see. And they contacted you directly, without going through proper channels?" A pause. "No, I don't think that's wise. Any major decisions should wait until the estate is properly settled." He handed the phone back to me, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. This wasn't going according to his plan, and David Morrison didn't like variables he couldn't control. "James says it's a time-sensitive opportunity," I told Sarah, "the kind of deal your father would have jumped on." Sarah looked torn between excitement and uncertainty. "It does sound like something Daddy would have been interested in. But David's right. Maybe we should wait." "Actually," David said, his voice taking on that smooth, persuasive tone I'd learned to distrust, "maybe Sarah should go. If this is as big as James suggests, we can't afford to let it slip away." The reversal surprised me. Why would David want Sarah away from home? "Really? You think I should go?" "I think your father would want you to explore every opportunity. And I'll feel better knowing you're safely away from here until we figure out who broke in and what they wanted." My blood chilled. David wasn't sending Sarah away for her protection. He was removing a witness. Whatever he planned to do to me, he didn't want his wife present to see it. "I could come with you?" I suggested. "No," David said quickly. "You need to stay here and deal with the police investigation. Besides, you've been through enough trauma for one day. Mom, he's right. You should rest." Sarah kissed my cheek. "I'll be back tomorrow night with good news, I hope." Within an hour, Sarah was on her way to the airport with a security detail that I prayed was FBI rather than Morrison's people. David's men remained at the estate, positioning themselves strategically around the grounds under the guise of providing protection. I was trapped in my own home, surrounded by killers, waiting for Agent Chen's plan to unfold. As evening approached, David dismissed the household staff, claiming they needed privacy to discuss sensitive family matters. One by one, the people who might have witnessed what was about to happen disappeared, leaving only David, his men, and me in the sprawling house that suddenly felt like a tomb. "Victoria," David said as we sat in the living room after dinner, "I think we need to have an honest conversation." "About what?" "About what you and James really found last night." The mask was finally slipping. David's boyish charm was being replaced by something colder, more predatory. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. The safe in Marcus's study hadn't been opened by burglars. It was opened by someone who knew the combination, someone like his wife. Stevens and the other man, introduced as Walker, moved to block the exits." My mouth went dry. "David, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the evidence Marcus hid before he died. Financial records, audio recordings, photographs. The things you and James dug up from the greenhouse last night." He knew. Somehow, he knew everything. Please don't insult my intelligence, Victoria. We followed the tracks from the greenhouse to the old carriage house, then to the stable. Very clever escape route, by the way. I almost admire Marcus for thinking it through so thoroughly. David stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where he'd placed his men. "The question now is what you've done with the evidence and who else knows about it." "I don't know what you're talking about." He turned back to me, and his expression was no longer even pretending to be pleasant. "Let me explain your situation, Victoria. Your husband is dead. I made sure of that. Your daughter is on a plane to Los Angeles, completely unaware that she's married to the man who killed her father." And you're alone in this house, with people who have killed more times than you can imagine. Sarah will inherit everything when you die of grief-induced heart failure later tonight. Very sad, but not uncommon for elderly widows who've suffered severe trauma. She'll need her husband's comfort and guidance more than ever. The casual way he discussed my murder made it clear this wasn't a threat. It was an inevitability. Unless Agent Chen's people were as good as she claimed, I had minutes rather than hours to live. The evidence, David continued, will disappear, along with anyone who might have seen it. James Crawford will have a tragic accident on his way back from New York. Very unfortunate, but these things happen. You won't get away with this. I already have, 12 times over the past 10 years. You're just another rich family that bit off more than they could chew. Stevens pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid. This'll be quick, Mrs. Whitmore. Potassium chloride. It'll look like a heart attack, and by the time anyone thinks to do a thorough autopsy, it'll be too late to detect. I closed my eyes and thought of Marcus, hoping that wherever he was, he knew I'd tried to save our family. Then the lights went out, and all hell broke loose. At my husband's funeral, Final Chapters, Chapter 10, Justice in the Darkness. The house plunged into absolute darkness as the power grid was cut, and the silence that followed was broken by the sharp crack of windows shattering as FBI tactical teams entered from multiple directions. Red laser dots danced across the walls as night vision and tactical lighting turned the familiar living room into a war zone. "Federal agents, nobody move!" The voice boomed through a megaphone, but Stevens and Walker were already in motion, trained soldiers responding to an ambush. Gunfire erupted, sharp, controlled bursts that echoed through the house like thunder. I threw myself behind Marcus's leather chair as bullets splintered the coffee table where I'd been sitting moments before. In the strobing muzzle flashes, I caught glimpses of black-clad figures moving through the house with military precision. "Victoria, stay down!" Agent Chen's voice cut through the chaos. David Morrison, or Daniel Kowalski, or whatever his real name was, had disappeared in the confusion. But I could hear him shouting orders to his men, coordinates and tactical instructions that suggested this wasn't his first firefight. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the gunfire finally stopped, emergency lighting bathed the room in harsh white glare. Stevens lay motionless near the window, the syringe that would have killed me shattered on the floor beside him. Walker was on his knees, hands zip-tied behind his back, blood streaming from a head wound, but David was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" Agent Chen demanded, pressing her weapon to Walker's neck. "Gone," Walker gasped. "Tunnel system. He had escape routes mapped from day one." Of course he did. A man who'd survived this long by preying on wealthy families would have planned for every contingency, including federal raids. The estate was old, sprawling, with architectural features and hidden passages that could provide dozens of escape routes. "How many ways out?" Agent Chen asked. "Enough." She keyed her radio. "This is Chen. Primary target is mobile. Lock down the perimeter and initiate manhunt protocols." But I knew it was too late. David had a head start, knowledge of the terrain and resources we could only guess at. He was already gone. "Mrs. Whitmore." A paramedic knelt beside me, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "No. Shaken, but not hurt." I struggled to my feet, looking around at the destruction. "Is it over?" "The immediate threat is neutralized," Agent Chen said. "But Morrison is still out there." "What about Sarah?" "Safe. She's in FBI custody in Los Angeles. We intercepted her at the airport and explained the situation. She's processing it." I could only imagine. Learning that your husband is a serial killer who murdered your father would shatter anyone's world. But Sarah was strong. She'd survive this, eventually. "And Marcus?" Agent Chen smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "Why don't you ask him yourself?" Marcus emerged from the kitchen, flanked by 2 FBI agents. He looked older, worn down by months of hiding and planning, but his eyes were bright with relief and vindication. "It's over, Victoria. Finally over." I ran to him, not caring about the agents or the crime scene or anything except the fact that my husband was alive and safe. "I thought I'd lost you forever." "Never," he whispered into my hair. "I told you 37 years ago that death couldn't part us. I meant it." "What happens now?" I asked Agent Chen. "Now we clean up. Walker and the surviving members of Morrison's team will face federal charges for murder, fraud, racketeering, enough to put them away for life. Morrison himself," she shrugged, "we'll find him eventually. Men like that can't stay hidden forever." "And our family?" "Officially, Marcus Whitmore died 3 days ago and was buried yesterday. It'll take some legal maneuvering to resurrect him, but it can be done. The FBI has experience with witness protection cases that require creative documentation." Marcus took my hand, his touch real and warm and alive. "There's something else, Victoria, something I need to tell you about the business." "What?" "It's gone. All of it. Morrison's people have been systematically looting our accounts for months. The estate, the development projects, the investment portfolios. It's all been transferred to shell companies and offshore accounts. The magnitude of it hit me like a physical blow. 40 years of building, striving, creating an empire, all of it stolen by a man we'd welcomed into our family." "How much?" "Almost everything. Maybe 50 million left in accounts they couldn't access immediately. The house, some personal assets, but the business empire." Marcus's voice was heavy with loss. $400 million, Victoria. Gone. I should have been devastated. I should have collapsed under the weight of losing everything we'd built together. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief. "Marcus," I said, squeezing his hand, "do you remember what we had when we got married?" "Each other, and about $20,000 between us. And we built an empire from that. We can do it again." He looked at me with wonder. The same expression he'd worn 37 years ago when I'd agreed to marry a young man with more ambition than assets. "You're not angry." "I'm furious. But not at losing money, at losing time. At David stealing days and weeks and months from our lives together. Money we can replace, time we can't." Agent Chen cleared her throat delicately. "If it helps, the FBI's Asset Forfeiture Division is very good at tracking down stolen funds. Morrison's network was sophisticated, but not invisible. We'll recover what we can." "That would be welcome," Marcus said. "But Victoria's right. We've started over before." Over the next several hours, as FBI technicians processed the crime scene and agents took our statements, the full scope of Morrison's operation became clear. He hadn't just targeted our family. We were part of a web that included at least 8 other wealthy families across the country. The investigation would take years to unravel completely, but our part in it was finished. Epilogue. 6 months later. The new house was smaller than the estate we'd lost, a comfortable colonial in Georgetown that cost a fraction of what we'd once considered modest expenses. But it felt like home in a way the mansion never had. Perhaps because we'd chosen it together, without the weight of expectations or the need to project power and success. Marcus was officially alive again, thanks to creative paperwork and a sympathetic federal judge who understood the unique circumstances of the case. The death certificate had been voided, the funeral deemed a necessary deception in a federal investigation. It had caused quite a stir in Washington social circles. The resurrection of Marcus Whitmore was the gossip of the season. Sarah was in therapy, working through the trauma of discovering that her marriage had been built on lies and manipulation. She'd filed for divorce the moment she learned the truth, but the healing would take much longer. For now, she was staying with us, rebuilding her sense of trust in her own judgment. "Mom?" She appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. "There's an article you should see." The headline made my breath catch. FBI arrests notorious con man in Miami sting operation. David Morrison's photograph stared back at me from the front page. But he looked different again, this time older with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. The article detailed his capture during an attempted infiltration of another wealthy family, his arrest facilitated by evidence gathered during the Whitmore investigation. He was targeting a pharmaceutical heiress, Sarah said quietly, a woman about my age whose father had recently died. Thank God they caught him before he could do to her what he did to us. Sarah's voice was steady, but I could see the pain in her eyes. Agent Chen called this morning. Morrison's network is completely dismantled. 17 arrests, including 3 other infiltrators who were in the middle of long-term cons. I set down the newspaper and pulled my daughter into a hug. It's really over. The criminal case, yes. The emotional healing, she managed a weak smile. That's going to take longer. Marcus joined us in the kitchen, looking more rested than he had in months. The stress of living in hiding, of watching his family from a distance while unable to protect them, had taken its toll. But gradually he was becoming himself again. Any word from the asset recovery team? I asked. Better than expected. They've traced about $200 million to accounts Morrison thought were untouchable. It'll take years to work through the legal process, but we'll get most of it back eventually. It was more than we dared hope for, but the money felt less important now. What mattered was that we were together, that the threat was gone, that our family, damaged but intact, could begin to heal. There's something else, Marcus said, pulling a letter from his pocket, from James. James Crawford had started his own consulting firm with the $50 million Marcus had left him in the real will, the one hidden beneath the fake documents Morrison had forced him to sign. He'd offered to return it all when the truth came out. But Marcus had insisted he keep it. James had been a loyal partner for 15 years. He deserved to build something of his own. He wants to know if we'd be interested in a new project, Marcus continued. A smaller development in Southeast D.C., community-focused, affordable housing with retail spaces for local businesses. What did you tell him? That I'd discuss it with my partner. I looked around the kitchen, smaller than what we'd been accustomed to, but filled with morning sunlight and the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of my daughter's laughter as she read the newspaper's account of Morrison's capture. Your partner says yes, I told him, but on one condition. What's that? No more secrets, no more hidden plans or protected information. If we're going to rebuild, we do it together, all of us. Marcus smiled, the same smile that had won my heart when we were both young and poor and convinced we could conquer the world. Deal. Sarah looked up from the newspaper. Does this mean I can help? I've been thinking about what I want to do with my life, and real estate development sounds interesting. It means, Marcus said, that the Whitmore family is back in business, older, wiser, and considerably more careful about who we trust. Outside, Georgetown buzzed with its usual morning energy. Tourists heading to museums, government workers hurrying to meetings, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Once, I might have looked down on such mundane existence from the heights of wealth and power. Now it looked like freedom. The roses in our small garden weren't as elaborate as the ones that had hidden Marcus's evidence, but they bloomed just as beautifully. I'd planted them myself, with my own hands, in soil that belonged to us, not as symbols of an empire built for others to admire, but as a promise of new growth, new beginnings, new chances to get things right. 6 months ago, I'd stood beside what I thought was my husband's grave, receiving condolences from people who saw our tragedy as an opportunity for advancement. Today, I stood in a kitchen filled with sunlight and love, and the voices of my family, planning a future that was smaller in scope but infinitely richer in meaning. David Morrison, Daniel Kowalski. whatever his real name was, would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His network was destroyed, his victims could finally have justice, and his reign of terror was over. But perhaps the greatest victory was this: he'd tried to steal our legacy, our fortune, our very lives. Instead, he'd given us something infinitely more valuable. He'd reminded us what really mattered. Marcus reached for my hand across the breakfast table, the same gesture he'd made thousands of times over 37 years of marriage. But this time, it felt like a miracle. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I'm thinking," I said, "that it's a beautiful day to be alive." And for the first time in months, that was absolutely, completely true. The end.